In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to do touch-up soldering, fix some common soldering problems, and I'll show you how to put a beaded finish on both straight and rounded edges. One of the most common problems when you are soldering is sometimes you get really rough seams. If you have really rough seams, you can go over them, but be very careful about going over them a lot. Because if you keep going over and over and over these solder seams, what'll end up happening is you'll start to see the adhesive start to creep out from underneath your solder seams. And that just means that your adhesive is about giving up on the heat. The heat from the soldering iron activates the adhesive, but then what ends up happening is it starts to deteriorate. So you can go back over these seams and just melt the existing solder. This is the second side of a student project, so you're going to see some air bubbles going on. Ooh, yeah, lots of explosions going on. And when those air bubbles pop, they just create a textured surface on your solder seam. And so you've got to fill those air bubbles in, and you've got to keep that solder moving around this area that you're trying to do. Right here is a really common problem. If you can see, this person kind of went over and over and over this seam, and what ended up happening is the solder finally went through, which means we have the melted solder on top, it went through to the other side, and it made a blob. These can happen if you have one of the following things. Either you have a gap, a large gap, and you have to fill it with so much solder that it keeps the solder at the melting temperature and it just keeps running through. Or you've got flux on both sides. If you have flux on both sides, it accelerates the rate at which your solder is going to melt. So it will melt the solder on the front, but it will also melt the solder on the back if there's flux on both sides. The third thing is that you've just gone over it so many times that the solder on this side started to reach the melting temperature. Even if there is no flux on this side, metal conducts heat, and if you keep it at that melting temperature, this solder will eventually melt as well. So the solution when you're doing one side is to try and do it as quickly as possible, to put the right amount of solder on the first time, and don't keep going over and over and over, because that just makes your solder hotter and hotter and hotter, and finally the melting temperature is met on this side and then the solder runs through. So you're chasing heat when you're soldering. So what to do to fix the blobs? So I have a solder blob right here, and here's what I'm going to do. It is a little too much solder for me to try to melt into the seam and to try and bring it around. If I had a blob right close to the edge, what I would do is I would just drag that extra solder off, and so it would just pull off. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to turn this panel over, and I'm going to put my iron right there. And I want to be able to see this, so I'm going to put my iron right there and just kind of flick it off with my iron. You want all of it to come off. Just be really careful, because you don't want to hold the iron there too much, because you don't want to crack your glass. So I'm taking all the extra off there. And there's a little bit of stuff right there too, which we'll fix in a sec. Now what I really have to do here is I have to make sure there's no flux on both sides, and I have to cool this down. So I'm going to just I let it cool for a couple of seconds after I've soldered it, but then I take it and I wipe off both sides, because this is going to cool it down. So I've got a sponge with water and I just wipe it down a little bit. Then, only putting flux on one side at a time, I will take this, put a little flux on there, and I'm just going to go over it very quickly. And I'm going to try and do this one time. Oh, I lied twice. Now, I'm done with that side. It's exactly the way I want it. It's got a nice bead, and that's the way it's going to stay. So now, once it's set up, I'm going to take that sponge very quickly, wipe off the flux. I'm going to cool it down. It's still very hot, so I'm just going to cool it down. If you're really smart about it, you'd walk away or you would concentrate on a different part of your window. But right now, I am concentrating on fixing just this part right here. So I'm going to cool it down again, wipe it down, and now I've turned this side over, and I'm applying flux to this side, and I'm going to just go over it once, maybe twice. Once. Oh, that's not enough. I'm going to do it again. Now, that's the way I'm doing that. That's good. So this takes some practice to really get a good bead. I just happen to love soldering, so I hope I made that look really easy, because with practice and patience, you will get to be that quick. If you have a little spill or a little splat like that, you can't pick this off because it's connected to your foil. So what you can do is you can dab it. This is literally touch and lift up. And you can do that, and then you can pick off that little part right there. This part right here is a little flat, and so all you do there is you just add a little bit more. But I usually like to start at a joint and end at a joint. And I just get the solder going. Sometimes I will drag it back over. Maybe one more time. There we go. And now I'm done with that seam. I like to see solder seams that smooth. So that's what I try and do the first time that I put the solder on. Anything that has an unfinished edge to it, or just a tinned edge, and by a tinned edge I'm talking, all I've done here is I've run the iron across and tinned all the foil. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to put a bead of solder on top of here. That is actually called edge finishing. That makes it look more like it's finished. And so here's what I'm going to do. I set it up right, like this, and these are called solder wedgies. They're really handy to have. I usually like to have at least 2 of them. And I set my project up like this. I happen to have a fume extractor here. So here's what I do. I put flux across the top, and then I usually go perpendicular to it, so coming right at it like this. And I do what's called chopping and dabbing. Chopping and dabbing is putting a nice bead all across this top part here, all across these edges. You can do this to any edge, like the insides of boxes or anything that just has a raw edge. It makes it look finished and nice, and in my opinion, a lot more professional than just a tinned edge. This is a tinned edge here, and then this is a beaded edge. This edge has a rounded bead on it. This is where it stopped right here. So if you look the difference, this is a tinned edge where you can see the edges of your glass, and then that's where the break line meets. But then here is where it starts to be beaded. And what this is going to help do is every time you have a break line that hits an edge, it kind of makes a little bit of a dip sometimes. And what the edge finish is going to do is it's going to even out that edge, so long as your edge is straight. I'm going to continue. When you do this, you want to make sure that the flux is washed off the front and the back. And you want to make sure this is completely upright. It's a good idea to angle your iron down when you're doing this. Angling the iron down when you're putting a bead on here will help gravity pull the solder off of the tip of the iron. Works a whole lot better than any other angle. If any solder should drip, you should be able to just pick it right off if there's no flux on the front and the back of your window. See? You might have a little bit of difficulty if you're trying to edge finish something that has a rounded edge to it. So the way I go about doing it is I will rest it. I've got my fume extractor right above where I'm working. What I will usually do is you need to be parallel to the table when you're doing this. If you're doing a rounded edge, anytime you are doing your edge finish, you're going to need to rock your edge so that your edge is parallel to the table at all times. Otherwise, what ends up happening is if you hold your project like this and you're trying to do this rounded edge by depositing a bead all along here, the solder is going to roll. It's going to follow gravity. By the same token, you have to be very, very careful about where you're putting your hand and where you've got your solder. Solder will probably drip and you don't want it to get you. But if you're really careful, you can either hold the solder in your hand like this, or you can have the solder down below. I've already fluxed this edge, so what I'll do is I'll just show you. I get a little bit of solder and it will stay, and I bring it up and I'm angling my iron down and I'm edge finishing that way. You'll see the solder roll, and sometimes you can, when you've melted the solder, you can rock the edge a little bit so that when the solder is rolling, you can get it to spread a little bit more. Now this takes a lot of practice, so don't be too discouraged if you're not getting it right. So right now I'm on a straight side, and I've just dripped a little bit. And again, if you are doing the sides, if you're to the edge finishing portion of your soldering process, you have to make sure that both sides are completely free from flux. That way, when the solder drips, you'll be able to peel it off if it does drip. So now I'm going to try and get this part right in here. So I add a little flux, angling the iron down. Kind of pivoting this project a little bit more as I get to the rounded area. Edge finishing not only makes your edge look really nice, it also kind of stabilizes the edge foil a little bit better